Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The morning frost clung to the window pane of Eleanor Marsh's small cottage, crystalline patterns etching themselves across the glass like nature's own delicate artwork. She pressed her fingertips against the cold surface, watching her breath form clouds that momentarily obscured her view of the town below. Willowbrook sat nestled in the valley like a sleeping cat, smoke rising from chimneys in lazy spirals. It was a picturesque place, the kind that travelers remarked upon with admiration. But Eleanor knew the truth that lurked beneath those charming facades and cobblestone streets. Beauty could be cruel, and small towns possessed long memories and sharp tongues. She was 32 years old, unmarried, and in Willowbrook, that combination made her something between a curiosity and a cautionary tale. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and turned away from the window. The cottage was small but comfortable, purchased with the inheritance her grandmother had left her. It sat at the edge of town, close enough to walk to the market but far enough to provide some measure of solitude. She had made it her sanctuary, filling it with books, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock that had belonged to her father. The walk into town was something she had learned to dread and endure in equal measure. Today was market day, and her pantry would not fill itself. She dressed simply, as was her custom, in a gray wool dress that did nothing to enhance her appearance, but everything to protect against the autumn chill. Her hair, the color of chestnuts, she pinned back in a practical arrangement. There had been a time when she took care with her appearance, when she believed that the right dress or the perfect curl might catch someone's attention. That time had passed. The path into town wound through a small grove of birch trees, their leaves now turned golden and beginning to fall. Eleanor walked with purpose, her basket swinging at her side, rehearsing the mental armor she would need for the morning ahead. She heard them before she saw them, the gaggle of women gathered near the fountain in the town square. Martha Hendricks, Patience Cole, and Sarah Whitmore formed their usual triumvirate of judgment, heads bent together like conspirators. When they spotted Eleanor, their whispers became theatrical, pitched just loud enough to Carey. "There she goes, poor thing," Martha said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Another year older and still no husband to show for it. My Thomas says she must be touched in the head," Patience added. "What woman in her right mind turns down 3 proposals?" Eleanor kept walking, her spine straight, her eyes fixed ahead. She had long ago learned that responding only encouraged them. The proposals they spoke of had come years ago from men who saw her grandmother's cottage as compensation for taking on a plain-faced bride. She had refused them all, and would do so again without regret. Perhaps she prefers the company of cats. Sarah Whitmore laughed, and the others joined in, their amusement ringing across the square. Eleanor reached the baker's stall and selected a loaf of bread, counting out her coins with steady hands despite the heat she felt rising in her cheeks. Old Mr. Perkins, the baker, gave her a sympathetic look but said nothing. Sympathy was almost worse than mockery. At least mockery was honest. The butcher was next, then the woman who sold vegetables from her garden. At each stop, Eleanor felt the weight of eyes upon her, the whispered conversations that paused when she approached and resumed when she moved away. She had become the town's favorite entertainment, the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters: "Marry young, or you'll end up like Eleanor Marsh, alone, unwanted, forgotten." The truth was more complicated, as truth always is. Eleanor had been engaged once, at 19, to a young man named Robert Carey. He had been handsome and charming, with a laugh that made her feel like the sun had broken through clouds. She had loved him with the complete abandon that only the young possess. 3 weeks before their wedding, Robert had left town with the daughter of the mayor. a girl with golden curls and a dowry that dwarfed anything Eleanor could offer. She heard later that they settled in Boston, had 4 children, and lived quite happily. She hoped it was true. Bitterness was a poison she refused to swallow, though sometimes it crept up her throat unbidden. After Robert, there had been offers but no love. Eleanor discovered that she would rather be alone than settle for companionship without affection. It was a choice that Willowbrook could not understand or forgive. She completed her shopping and began the walk home, her basket now heavy with provisions. The morning sun had burned away the frost, and the day had warmed enough that she loosened her shawl. Perhaps she would work in her garden this afternoon, pull the last of the carrots, and prepare the beds for winter. The sound of hooves made her step to the side of the path, expecting one of the local farmers. Instead, a stranger rode past on a massive gray horse, slowing as he approached her. He was unlike any man she had seen in Willowbrook. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard that suggested weeks away from civilization. His clothes were rough but well-made, practical garments designed for hard use. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray as storm clouds and startlingly direct. "Pardon me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm looking for the Marsh cottage. I was told it sits at the edge of town." Eleanor blinked in surprise. No one sought her out. "I am Eleanor Marsh. The cottage belongs to me." Something flickered in those gray eyes. Interest, perhaps, or reassessment. He swung down from his horse with surprising grace for a man of his size. Standing before her, he seemed to block out the sun. "My name is Silas Crane. Your grandmother, God rest her, was a friend to my mother many years ago. Before my mother passed last spring, she asked me to deliver something to the Marsh family. I've been trying to make my way here for months." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Her grandmother had owned one just like it, had called it a memory box, a tradition from the old country. "Your mother was Catherine?" Eleanor asked, the name surfacing from childhood memories. "I remember my grandmother speaking of her. They grew up together before my grandmother moved here." Silas nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face. "They wrote letters until my mother's hands became too painful to hold a pen. She treasured those letters. Said your grandmother understood her in a way no one else did." Eleanor took the box carefully, feeling its weight in her hands. "Thank you for bringing this. You've come a long way. I live in the mountains, about 4 days' ride from here. I don't often come down to settlements." He glanced around, taking in the town visible in the distance. "I can see why. People tend to make things complicated." Eleanor laughed despite herself, a genuine sound that surprised her. "That is perhaps the truest thing anyone has said to me in years." Silas looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel seen rather than judged. "I don't mean to impose, but I've been writing since dawn. Might I trouble you for some water before I continue on?" She should have refused. Propriety demanded it. A single woman inviting a strange man to her home was the kind of scandal that would fuel Willowbrook's gossip for months. But Eleanor found that she no longer cared what Willowbrook thought. "Come," she said. "I'll make tea." The cottage seemed smaller with Silas inside it, his presence filling the space in a way that was not uncomfortable but certainly noticeable. He sat at her small kitchen table while she prepared tea, his eyes taking in the books on her shelves, the herbs drying by the window, the small paintings she had made of the mountains visible in the distance. "You live alone," he observed. It was not a question. "I do, by choice, before you ask." She set a cup before him and took her own seat across the table. "The town has opinions about that, but I've found their opinions to be of little value." Silas wrapped his large hands around the cup, steam rising between them. "I understand solitude. I've lived alone in the mountains since my mother passed. Some people aren't made for the noise of crowds. What do you do there, in the mountains?" "I trap in winter mostly. Guide hunting parties in the fall. The land provides what I need. Ed, and I provide for myself. He took a sip of tea. It's a simple life, honest. No one telling you who you should be or what you should want. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. Here was someone who understood, who had chosen a similar path for similar reasons. They talked for hours, the tea growing cold and then forgotten. Silas told her about the mountains, about peaks that touched the clouds and valleys where no human had ever walked. He described winters so fierce that the world became nothing but white, and summers so beautiful they hurt to remember. Eleanor told him about her books, about the poetry she wrote in the quiet hours of the evening, about the garden that had become her meditation. The sun had begun its descent when Silas finally rose to leave. At the door, he paused, turning back to face her. I have to return home. Winter is coming and there are preparations to make. He hesitated, something uncertain crossing his features for the first time. But I would like to write to you, if you would permit it. Your grandmother and my mother found something valuable in their correspondence. Perhaps we might find the same. Eleanor felt her heart quicken, a sensation so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify. Hope. I would like that very much. The letters began arriving 2 weeks later, carried by a trader who passed through the mountains. They were long letters, filled with observations about nature and solitude, questions about her thoughts and feelings, and a humor that was dry but deeply kind. Eleanor found herself rushing to the post office, no longer dreading her walks through town. Let them whisper. She had something worth having now. She wrote back with equal length and care, finding herself saying things she had never spoken aloud. She told him about the mockery she endured, about the loneliness that sometimes crept in despite her contentment with solitude. She told him about Robert and the wound that had healed but left a scar. Silas responded with his own stories of loss and his own choices to live apart from a world that seemed determined to misunderstand him. Spring came slowly to Willowbrook, and with it came Silas himself. He arrived on a morning bright with new growth, his horse loaded with furs to trade and his eyes seeking hers across the market square. Eleanor ran to him without caring who watched, and when he swept her into his arms, she heard the gasps of the gathered townspeople like music. I've come to ask you something, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I've come to ask if you'll share my mountain. It's a hard life, but it's honest, and I find that I can no longer imagine it without you. The whispers that erupted were different this time, shocked and scandalized and perhaps touched with envy. Eleanor looked at the faces of her tormentors, at Martha and Patience and Sarah, at all the people who had spent years aching her feel small. Then she looked at Silas, at the hope and love she saw in those gray eyes, at the future he was offering. Yes, she said. Yes, I will. They were married in the small church at the edge of town with only the minister and 2 witnesses who happened to be passing through. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress, and Silas had trimmed his beard for the occasion. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding she had once planned with Robert, and it was perfect. The morning they left Willowbrook, Eleanor paused at the edge of town to look back one final time. The cottage had been sold to a young couple just starting their lives. Her books were packed on Silas's horse, along with her herbs and her grandmother's memory box. Any regrets? Silas asked, taking her hand. Not a single one. The mountain was everything he had described and more. Their cabin was small but sturdy, built with Silas's own hands. The views stretched forever, and the silence was the kind that healed rather than hurt. Eleanor learned to track and trap, to preserve meat and tan hides. Silas learned to love poetry and to appreciate the garden she cultivated in the short mountain summer. Years later, when traders brought news from the valley, they sometimes carried gossip about Willowbrook. The town's spinster had run off with a wild man. People still said, shaking their heads, she must have been desperate to accept such a life. Eleanor would smile when she heard such reports, bouncing her dhow at her on her knee, while their son helped his father chop wood outside. Let them think what they wanted. She had found what she never knew she was searching for, not despite being mocked and dismissed, but perhaps because of it. The life she had been told to want had never fit her. This life, hard and beautiful and shared with a man who saw her truly, was the one she was meant to live. The mountain kept its own counsel, and so did Eleanor Crane. She had learned that the opinions of others were like weather, passing through and leaving little trace if you did not let them settle in your bones. She had also learned that love, when it finally came, did not arrive in the expected package or at the expected time. It came when you stopped looking, in a form you did not recognize, and it transformed everything. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children slept and the fire burned low, Silas would take her hand and they would sit on their porch, watching the stars emerge over their mountain kingdom. No words were needed in those moments. They had said everything that mattered, and would say it again tomorrow, and every day after that. The Spinster of Willowbrook had found her home, and it was grander than any cottage or fine house in the valley below. It was built of love and choice, and the courage to be true to herself, and it would stand forever in the shadow of the mountains that had given her back her heart